Welcome, everyone, to the German Canadian Media Symposium. I'm Shri Paradkar. I'm a William Southam Journalism Fellow this year at Massey College. Let me begin by acknowledging that Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous people have lived since time immemorial. It is on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship towards the land and the great privilege that we have to work on this land. In relation to the event today, the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reminds us that the media play a crucial role in educating the public and through public scrutiny can hold the state accountable for its actions. It is in this spirit that we welcome you to the symposium, which is now in its sixth year. The symposium is organized by the German Consulate General in Toronto, along with Massey College and the University of Toronto. And it's with great pleasure that I would like to introduce Christina Toni, the Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany since 2023. She has been the German diplomatic service for over 20 years and previously served at the German embassies in Washington, D.C. and Beijing, as well as in numerous functions in the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin, most recently as the Deputy Head of Defense and Security Policy Division. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you, Sri. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests here present, and of course also online. Welcome to the sixth edition of the German Canadian Media Symposium. I'm very happy that this event has proven to be an integral part of our annual calendars. In these times of uncertainty and crisis, people to people contacts are more important than ever. I'm glad that about a month ago, in continuation of a program that is going on for already 15 years, the Massey College William Southam Journalism Fellows, who organize and participate in today's symposium, had the chance to travel to Germany. And they had the chance to meet with a wide array of counterparts in German media, in public broadcasting, traditional print media, in not-for-profit investigative networks, as well as with civil society and public officials. This media symposium is another fantastic opportunity to bring together German and Canadian journalists and experts. Last year, we discussed journalism in times of crisis. And unfortunately, things have not changed. Russia is continuing its war of aggression against Ukraine with the same intensity. And the conflict in the Middle East following Hamas' unprecedented terrorist attacks on Israel on October 7th last year is as tense as ever. And this is where we want to build on this year. The Middle East conflict challenges media with special complexity in every sense, politically, economically, morally, in terms of security, accessibility, or in terms of geographical reach. This year, we have decided to bring together journalists and experts for an in-depth discussion on how media can offer the fullest, most accurate reflection of what is happening on the ground. I'm looking forward to a substantive exchange and also new perspective on how to ensure coverage of conflicts can be as comprehensive as possible. I'm pleased that we were able to attract excellent speakers from Germany and Canada for today's discussion. A warm welcome to all of you. So please allow me to introduce all distinguished panelists in an alphabetic order. Sonia Fatah, Associate Professor at Toronto's Metropolitan University School of Journalism and co-lead of the Canada Press Freedom Project. Konstantin Nowotny, writer and editor currently working for the German daily newspaper Taz, who in 2021 spent 2 months at the Israeli newspaper Haaretz in Tel Aviv as part of the IGP Fellowship Program. He is joining us online from Berlin. Justin Salhani, Beirut-based correspondent for Al Jazeera, who has also done freelance reporting for numerous media, including the LA Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and many more, also joining us virtually from the ground in Lebanon. I also warmly welcome our moderator, longtime local journalist and current journalism fellow Jonathan Goldsby, who will be taking our panel through the upcoming discussion. And I would also welcome journalism fellow Mustafa Al-Assar, who will deliver some opening remarks. He is a multidisciplinary journalist and human rights defender from Egypt, who spent 4 years in prison in his home country for his journalistic work and arrived in Canada via Lebanon under Canada's Human Rights Defender Refugee Program. Our discussion today will take us through both the decision-making processes in German and Canadian newsrooms, as well as the practices of the very important on-the-ground journalism and the challenging it poses in order to offer accurate and reliable information to our audiences. Some key questions for the discussions could be: how can journalists cover stories in situations of war with limited access? How can security be ensured? How can journalists obtain information on the ground through local sources? What other actors need to be taken into account? How are journalists able to verify or disprove information and misinformation spreading rapidly in today's social media environment? I look forward to your professional and your personal insights, and I thank you all for sharing them today. My sincere gratitude and thanks goes to Massey College and the University of Toronto for the excellent cooperation over the past years, and to both our teams for organizing this event. So I wish us a joyful discussion, and thank you very much.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. My name is Mustafa Al-Asar, an Egyptian journalist who moved recently to Canada. I'm currently a journalism fellow at Massey College. Before diving into the topic, I would like to ask the audience, are you familiar with the name Taha Hussein? Anyone knows who is Taha Hussein? Okay. Taha Hussein was an Egyptian writer, intellectual, who lived in the last century. He is considered one of the greatest writers of his time. And his story is incredibly inspiring. Born in 1889 and passing away in 1973. He lost his sight at the age of 4. Despite this, he pursued his education and became the first person to earn a PhD from Cairo University. He later traveled to France for further studies, earning a second doctorate before returning to Egypt as a professor of history and Arabic literature. After that, he became the Minister of Education, leading the fight to make education free in Egypt at the time when it was accessible only to the wealthy. His famous declaration, "Education is like water and air," reflects his vision for accessible education. Taha Hussein authored a groundbreaking book titled On Pre-Islamic Poetry, in which he applied Descartes' method of doubt to critically examine certain assumptions in Arabic history and literature. This book stirred significant controversy as religious scholars accused him of heresy and atheism. They feared his critical approach might undermine traditional interpretation of the Quran. The controversy led to his dismissal from the university, but he remained steadfast in his views. Hussein observed that Orientalists were free to critically examine Arabic and Egyptian history, while Egyptians who adopted similar methods faced accusations and attacks. This realization led to his famous statement, "We are more entitled to our history than they are," referring to foreign researchers and Orientalists. Why am I sharing this story, and how does it relate to today's discussion? I share this story because a similar dynamic exists today regarding local journalists and correspondents in the Middle East and their relationships with Western media outlets. I will briefly highlight a few points before leaving floor to our panelists. When local and Western correspondent work for the same media outlet, there is often a stark disparity in pay, with Western journalists earning sometimes salaries up to 10 times higher. Many local correspondents work on freelance contract, leaving them without full protection, benefits, or job security. These contracts can be terminated at any time without rights. Some Western media outlets display a lack of trust in local journalists, requiring a Western supervisor or manager to oversee their work. This person ultimately decides the priorities and editorial angles and holding final authority. In many cases, this manager or supervisor lack like enough knowledge about the country being covered, the interests of their people, or the historical and geopolitical context. Sometimes the manager may have never visited the country they oversee, instead pushing instruction from offices in far off continents, ignoring the insight of journalists on the ground. This lack of understanding about local context can expose journalists and correspondents to significant risks, including targeted attack by oppressive regimes, hostility from local communities, or even threats from extremist group or hired enforcers. My main point is that local journalists and correspondents deserve equal treatment and rights as their Western correspondents. They need greater trust in their expertise, more autonomy in their work, and the authority to shape priorities. After all, they are truly more entitled to their history, to their country, than Western journalists or Orientalists. Before I wrap my speech, I must highlight a dangerous alarm regarding coverage in the Middle East. The latest report from Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, issued yesterday, November 25, showed that, and I quote, at least 137 journalists and media workers were among the more than 10,000 killed in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and Lebanon since the war began, making it the deadliest period for journalists since CPJ began gathering data in 1992. Thank you for your attention.
Great. So thank you, Mustafa. That was excellent and incredibly enlightening and very helpful context and perspective. Oh, my name is John. Yeah, as the Consul General said, my name is Jonathan Goldsby. I'm one of the William Southam Journalism Fellows at Massey College. Pardon? Oh, even closer. Okay, sorry, my apologies. As the first of all, I thank Mustafa for adding that perspective and context that was quite necessary, and I think a foundational understanding for us to have going into this discussion. As the Consul General said, my name is Jonathan Goldsby. I'm one of the William Southam Journalism Fellows at Massey College for the current academic year. So just wrapping up month 3 of 8. Doing that. And one of the things that the Journalism Fellows do each year, or at least have done for each of the past 6 years, is organize this symposium. And when we were trying to decide what do we tackle, what topic are we going to have for this year's German Canadian Media Symposium, one of the first things we did, or one of the first things I thought of, was like, let's go see what every single panel and every single discussion they've had in past years has been. So I made a spreadsheet, and one thing that immediately became evident was that each year they selected a topic that, each of the fellows selected a topic that was very much of the moment. What is the thing that is happening at that time, and what was an ongoing thing happening at that time, or that it's begun to happen recently, that had presented challenges for journalism that were novel, or at least manifesting differently or more acutely than they've had before? What were the things that journalists in Canada and Germany and other cases, many other places, are being confronted with, and what sort of solutions, or how are they wrestling with them as best they can? What points of commonality can we find? What can we potentially learn from each other? And I mean, at this point, goodness knows what nightmares the second Trump era may bring, but as things stand now, there probably isn't another subject or another topic that is more fraught or more challenging to cover, especially in Western media, than that of the Middle East, and particularly of Israel and Palestine, there are countless competing pressures. And when I say pressures, I mean, pressures from obligations of journalistic responsibility, from one's own institution, from organized lobbies and grassroots groups, from colleagues, employees, bosses, from audiences, and like from one's own conscience even. And I appreciated the Consul General describing there being a moral element to it, because that is something that I think, it arguably figures in all journalism, but it certainly comes up here. But it's hard to think of another topic from which pressure from each of those quarters, each of those places, is as consistently or as frequently intense. And of course, over the past few months, it's, the conflict has edged into more of a wider regional war. At the moment, the Israeli cabinet is discussing whether to approve a ceasefire deal with Hezbollah, but Beirut is being bombed, and I was going to throw to Justin to ask how he's doing, but apparently he's had to step out or log out. I'm not sure if he's going to be returning, but once again, if you're in a city in a country that is being bombed by another country, that is an excellent reason for dropping a Zoom call. Hopefully he'll be able to return. I want to make sure he's okay at the very least, but certainly would like his insights from the ground. But I also want to read, catching up on the live updates from Al Jazeera. This was a quote from the German foreign minister this morning, an hour ago, from Annalena Baerbock. Says the conflict between Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah is, quote, at a critical moment, perhaps a moment that also gives hope, as a ceasefire deal is within reach. Continuing the quote, at the same time, we know from the past few months that we cannot rely on hope alone. So, to put the questions to Sonia and to Konstantin, in the coverage you've done or in the coverage you've studied, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered that are or that seem particular to this issue? And actually, because Konstantin, would you like to go first?
Yes, I can go first. I mean, the time I was in Israel and Palestine is it's 3 years ago now, so long before the war, and I don't think you can really. The situation is entirely different right now, but if it was 3 years ago from now, I would tell you that it's challenging to go into Gaza and to report something there. Now it's impossible. So it's kind of bizarre to talk about this situation because there is factually no way to get in and to actually report something. And this comes on top of the challenges that reporting from Israel and Palestine poses to any journalist all of the time. I mean, in some ways, you could say that if you're neither Israeli or Palestinian, you're kind of privileged in Israel and Palestine to work there, because there are zones and areas of the country that the people that live in these countries cannot visit. And you, as an international reporter, you can travel around and try to visit them, like apply for getting information and to get there. But I think these situations may have changed now too. So the situation is, I think, pretty dire to talk about. I don't know if that really answers your questions, but this just as a remark.
I think it does. And Sonia, what do you think are the particular challenges?
Thank you. I think that there are so many challenges. I don't really know what to start with. But although this particular crisis, I don't use the word conflict anymore because I think conflict makes it sound a little less dire than it actually is. I think the crisis, we have a whole history of reportage on this particular crisis, and there's a lot to look at in the past that informs the sort of challenges we're seeing today. There is really nothing new in the problems of reporting on Israel and Palestine. It's just the sort of scale of it that is so absurd in this moment. And I think because we're having this conversation between Canada and Germany, which I think is really relevant given the historical framework of this story, I think we have a lack of capacity in our newsrooms to understand and apply the history of the crisis, the history of anti-Semitism and its relationship to the story of Israel, in how we cover the fate of Palestinians and the lack of compassion with which Palestinians are covered in Western media. I think that there's a lot of research that has been done over the last 20 or 30 years that demonstrates the problem of the newsroom, but there's very little action to respond to those critiques. And I think what we are desperately in need for is a conversation that is enabled, a sort of a bridge between here's what the research says, what are you going to do about it? And that is certainly not happening. It's almost like the research space and the practitioner space are two different spaces that are not in conversation with one another.
What do you think it would take for that to be healthier? And do you think this issue has, I mean, in some ways it's emblematic of maybe challenges that Western media has faced in covering up, well, many issues in other countries, and certainly many issues that involve racialized people anywhere, and the very particular dynamics that are that come through that maybe unconsciously or just basically they come through that coverage, and certain presumptions, certain premises that are brought into it. Do you think what do you think it would take to actually move forward on this issue?
I mean, I can speak from the Canadian perspective, not from the German perspective. Yes. But I think there's a couple of things. For one, Canadian J schools, journalism schools, which are supposed to be the places where some of these conversations are happening, are not taking the leadership really in, and I speak as an associate chair for journalism school saying that. I think that the journalism school is a place that should inspire a two-way conversation with the industry. At the moment, the industry sees the journalism school as a training ground for new emerging journalists. And that's not all that we do. There's much more research happening at the journalism school that needs to be seen as helpful to the industry in its directions and its movements. I also think that the mainstream news industry, not just in Canada, but in general, is sort of a relic in a way, and it is very resistant to change in the face of disruption that has been ongoing for the last 25 years since the advent of the internet. And I think that our resistance to new forms of journalism or new approaches to journalism is one of the reasons why we are losing our audiences. And I think like trying to repair that conversation and having journalists in the traditional mainstream newsroom kind of question some of their deep attachments to journalism standards and practices that are applied willy-nilly, depending on where they're applied. So you talk about press, freedom of the press, and we talk about all these kind of big ideals around impartiality, and when actually not able to apply them practically, the record shows how these principles are applied with a hypocrisy that does not come back into the newsroom as a conversation, or there's a resistance to that conversation. So I think of new generations, and I think of the next, the sort of crew of journalists who will come into our newsrooms. They're not reading the traditional news publications in the way that my generation did, or generations above me have. And I think we really need to connect with some of those kind of future pathways and think about, are the journalism standards and practices that we hold so sacred enough? Or where are the gaps in practice that we need to address? And creating more space for that conversation will be a starting point.
Constantine, would you say that would you say that you've counted similar issues in the context of the German media, whether those are generational between journalists coming up, the training, whether it's in terms of how the values are applied to different issues consistently or not?
Yeah, I think what Sonia just said also applies to the German media. A lot of it also applies to the German media, and I think I can also see that there's a newer and younger generation of journalists who grew up with social media, and they have a different perspective on many topics, but especially on the Middle East, because they're used to not reading traditional media and correspondents who maybe sit in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and basically report from Israel about Palestine. But what they do now is they check social media accounts and they look for actual Palestinian journalists and photographers who are on the ground in Gaza, and they're looking at this kind of information, and sometimes it's a very different kind of information than what is being reported in German media. So uh, there's also, like, on top of this, you briefly, I think, touched it, a certain sensibility that only applies to German media. Maybe we can get into that later, but I don't know. I don't know if I want to open up this topic, but I just wanted to say what Sonia said is true, and it's especially true and even more complicated in Germany because of these historical implications it has. But there needs to be a discussion about that, a conversation about that, I guess.
Are you able to talk about some of the ways that you've encountered those challenges that you think you might not have encountered? I mean, every country has obviously its own history, and every country has its own opportunities and limitations when doing journalism. Um, Germany, but yes, in particular, I mean, I think it's understood that there's a narrow range of discourse on this particular issue for obvious historical reasons and also less obvious historical reasons. Um, have you encountered challenges that you think you might not have encountered if you were elsewhere?
Um, I don't think I personally encountered these challenges because I know about these sensibilities and how they work in the typical German newsroom, and I would also know my way around them. But it is for me clear to see that especially international journalists are kind of shocked when they look at German media or when they work with German media, when they realize that they cannot say things the way they can say it almost anywhere else. And this comes from this kind of historical responsibility, the imagination that Germany has of itself, and this hypersensibility when it comes to Israel, Palestine, and anti-Semitism. Sometimes I think we're seeing a little change right now, but many times you will read news headlines, and if you translate them from German to English and you compare it to CNN or BBC or New York Times or whatever, it's the same incident that happened, and it's something completely different that is being reported in German. And that is a problem because this is what the audience thinks of the crisis, as Sonia just said it, and it shapes opinion. And I think this is like a weird mixture between actually trying to be the most responsible that you can be and some sort of fear that you might do it wrong, and you might do it wrong from the worst kind of perspective. Like you never want to be the German journalist who went too far criticizing Israel. No one wants that. So this leads to some sort of fear, I guess, which is very dangerous.
Thank you. I mean, something that we, as the Consul General noted, yeah, we were in Berlin about a month ago for a week and meeting with different people from different media organizations and media adjacent organizations. And one thing that did surprise me, it was remarkable, it was an insight, was that the number of journalists or people at mainstream institutions who said similar things to what you said in terms of not just that this is an issue, but the fact, well, actually, the fact that I wasn't sure whether to what extent it was known within German media, within German elite circles, that the discussion in Germany is perhaps different than it is elsewhere. And it was interesting to hear people not just acknowledge that, but also express frustration with it, albeit to then sort of go on, move. The next step is like sort of go, well, what can you do, or what can we do? What you noted, you mentioned that it sort of changed a bit recently. I know certainly there was that got international media attention. The artist Nan Golden spoke at the opening of an exhibition of hers in Berlin and gave a very blunt, fiery speech calling out Germany specifically on this issue. Do you think things have changed in terms of how this is discussed or how this can be discussed?
I think things are changing right now, and they are changing like right in front of me. So this is kind of bizarre for me to talk about, because I sometimes wake up and check the media I'm working for, and then I check social media, and I see that things are changing so drastically that I kind of find myself like, where am I in this thing? Where do I belong here? And did I also make some mistakes, or am I also like influenced by this? I think we are seeing a lot of change right now. You just mentioned that you heard that many journalists are aware of a certain, let's say, bias around this. The awareness is, I think, the first step in the right direction. People know that there's something, some implicit rules in German reporting on Israel and Palestine and anti-Semitism that are now not implicit anymore. And this is because, I think, mainly international journalists, reporters, photographs, or even filmmakers or art curators, like you just mentioned, come to Germany. They realize this, and they have the courage to speak up and say, this is not right. You should learn another lesson from your history, and this is not the lesson that you should learn. And but Sonia just pointed out that especially traditional media has this kind of they shy away pretty strongly from um, really actually embracing change, and I think this also applies here.
Thank you. Sonia, do you think the discourse in Canadian newsrooms or in just Canadian media itself has shifted over the past year? Or do you think it's largely the same
Um, hmm.
over the
I
past year or
mean,
even the past few years?
have there been some good stories? Yes.
Mhm.
But the bulk of the reporting reflects all of the same biases and all of the same challenges that we've had historically on coverage of this crisis. And I think, I have an understanding from a lot of people in the newsroom about the challenges they're facing. The public doesn't get to see the internal debate within the newsroom, right? So the public doesn't get to see the level of editorial oversight over stories that may be perceived to be pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli. As you know, I don't know if you know that the National Post, for example, does not allow the language pro-Palestinian. They only allow anti-Israel.
That
So
doesn't surprise me.
that's in their guide, right? And so I think what we don't know that even in the more liberal publications, so we might have the Toronto Star, which is supposedly follows the Atkinson's principles of social justice being at the core of reporting and so on. But you would have a story about that is seen to be potentially pro-Palestinian going through 8 or 9 or 10 levels of editing and decision not use this language, do not put in this word, or I would take this out of the story. And that same level of critique is not available for stories that may be seen slightly more pro-Israeli. So there is a bias in the newsroom itself. And what informs that bias is probably connected to newsroom composition and who is in editorial leadership and news publications, right? The editorial leadership in Canadian newsrooms, I did a snapshot a few years ago, which is not research quality work, but it was basically taking all the photographs of people in the C-suite across Canada's major newsrooms. And if you look at that visual, which I don't present publicly because it's not accurate research, but you get a sense of who is making decisions in Canada about Canadian newsrooms and about what the public should get. And in the days when I was reporting, I reported from India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. for the Globe and the Star. And in those days, I would be told very clearly, like, there's only one story out of Pakistan. I mean, it wasn't said in these words, but the story was the Taliban, terrorism. That was it. There was nothing else to report on Pakistan. And India had a sort of wider sort of composition of stories. You could do the Bollywood story, and you could do the business story, you could do the poverty story, but there were all these tropes, right? And the tropes, when we look at Israel and Palestine, are very specific. There's a difference in language that is used and how that language is used. There is a difference in who decides who is a reporter who can be trusted. So we know the New York Times had someone cover a major story where the accusations about sexual violence were portrayed by somebody who had no journalistic experience, but somehow that reporter was allowed to sort of participate in that story, and the New York Times has been able to recover from that. And that's a major issue. You go back in time and you see the New York Times in its coverage on the war in Iraq had a very senior reporter report on weapons of mass destruction when they did not exist because of their access to Pentagon sources. And so they inevitably supported a case for the war in Iraq. Those kinds of questions have been part of the discussion in newsrooms, but they haven't challenged the newsroom to genuinely shift directions. And so I think in the Canadian newsroom, you see all of the same problems. And in addition to that, you're seeing the growth of organizations like Honest Reporting Canada. That's code for Dishonest Reporting Canada. And what they do is they essentially look for any story that may be seen as pro-Palestinian, and they do action alerts. And they basically send out notes to a whole variety of supporters. And they harass the newsroom, and they harass the reporter, and they kind of blacklist the reporter in whatever way they can. Now, you would think that these kinds of organizations should not influence the record. They should not influence the editorial decision making, but they inevitably do, particularly in a time when newsrooms don't have the kinds of resources to fight back. What it does is it puts an additional pressure to silence a certain storytelling that should be happening. And then the other thing I'll just add there is it's a question of language that is used, right? What language is used in stories around Palestine or Israel? There is a sort of consistent use of language like barbaric, horrifying, massacre that is used for stories that are connected to October 7th, which was, a devastating attack, and it was horrific. Those same words are not applied in Canadian newsroom stories for anything that has been happening for over a year in Gaza. And there is evidence of a difference in how this is perceived. So there was a letter to the CBC ombudsperson by somebody asking, why is this difference of language used when you're talking about the killing of Israelis versus the killing of Palestinians? And the response by the public editor is staggeringly honest, but they're basically saying there's a difference between someone going in and knifing someone and using bombs from above to kill people.
Yeah, they said that was remote killing, the adjective barbaric or
Does
something
not,
to that effect.
Which I think begs a question about why these conversations, why we cannot be a little bit more sophisticated and layered in our conversations in the newsroom.
Thank you. Sonia, you mentioned the organization Honest Reporting Canada. It's a registered charity that is a spin-off of an American organization that I describe it as sort of systematizes pressure against newsrooms. It's very openly in favor of Israeli propaganda. I think it's a thing organization that raises the question of is there a point at which advocacy crosses the line into bullying, but we won't have to untie that. Described itself as I think they aim to be the digital army for Israel in Canada, and so they methodically do read through coverage of Israel and Palestine in Canadian media, including campus media. In generally speaking, if there's an article or perspective or something whose thrust they don't like, they will find issues within it because basically, no piece of journalism is perfect, so you can usually find flaws in anything. And they will encourage people to bombard the newsroom with emails, and or they will, point people to someone's Twitter account. And so it's a quite interesting, because there are certainly lots of organizations with lots of different interests in this broader issue, but I find this one is particularly fascinating, that it's a professional organization and charity that specifically focuses on communicating with and pressuring with media. Um, so Constantine, I'm wondering, do you find when you're covering these issues, or from people who've covered these issues in Germany, are there similar sorts of external pressures, and are there similar internal pressures in terms of, as Sonia alluded to, there perhaps being at least a perception of often being like different levels of scrutiny applied to different stories?
I think so. I think it's fair to say that there are different levels of scrutiny. I think Sonia pointed that out perfectly, and this also applies to Germany. You can easily go through numerous rounds of editing if you have any piece on the Israeli military at all, or even settler violence, which is something that is fairly undisputed if you look at any kind of media in Israel. And to be completely honest with you, I was surprised myself when I when I worked with Haaretz, or with Haaretz in 3 years ago, and I realized that even uh, the newspaper that is considered to be very liberal or even left-leaning in Israel is so much more critical of its own government, country, and military than any newsroom reporter I've ever seen in Germany. I don't think this applies to everything. I don't know every single reporter, so please don't take my opinion as a general thing. But I was surprised to see this, because this also means I have this bias in myself. So there is exactly that. And I think it's beginning to soften since the war, and yeah, especially what international journalists bring to the newsroom also in Germany. And yeah, but still, it's still a very complicated issue. You will have long discussions. The longest discussions you can have are always somehow connected to the Middle East, and I'm not quite sure where this leads.
Yeah, so you've spent some time with Haaretz. I mean, as you probably saw, that they've been sanctioned by the Israeli government sometime in the
Yeah.
past few days, which, to the extent of, I believe they pulled or are pulling all government advertising. They won't give them interviews. This being in particular in response to the critical coverage of the government and how it's prosecuted the war more generally, and I think in particular to remarks that the publisher has made in recent weeks, which are blunt criticism of of Netanyahu. Have you heard? Does this surprise you that that Haaretz is this happening?
Actually, it kind of shocked me, but I think no one in Israel is really shocked about this. But of course, it shocked me, because of what I just told you. And it's especially in preparation for this talk, I thought maybe when someone asks me how easy is it to get around in Israel with local journalists and just connect with someone who helps you out with a story, I would have answered it's pretty easy, because you have a lot of good resources. Many people speak good English, and it's easy to get along as long as you don't want to go too deep into Gaza. But now it's becoming clear that even if you want to work with Haaretz journalists, they now are facing an effective government ban. It's not just that the government doesn't post any ads in the newspaper anymore. It's they don't want to work with Haaretz at all. Like, government officials will not really work with Haaretz journalists at all. And we can debate about what the Haaretz publisher Amos Schocken said and how you would interpret it. I don't think this is acceptable at all. And this only shows you that reporting in Israel gets more complicated and difficult, and somehow, I mean, every newsroom is dependent on having at least a couple of sources And if you want to work with Israeli journalists right now, it is not guaranteed that they can help you.
And this, of course, follows on, I guess, the more formal bans or shutting down of Al Jazeera's operations, his operations in Israel back in the spring, and then his operations in the West Bank back in September, which I guess also now I think allows us to pivot to the question of foreign correspondents and local journalists. And as we said, one of the challenges about one of the particular things and unusual things about the Gaza conflict or war or in or on Gaza, which depending on your preferred preposition, is that journalists aren't allowed, and people generally, but journalists in particular, including journalists, are not allowed in from outside. So that's exclusively relying on local journalists. Whereas in Lebanon, for example, there is both a robust local journalism, the local group of local journalists, as well as journalists coming from elsewhere. I've often, wondered how that affects how things play out in practice in terms of what's portrayed and what's seen. But I guess, the question is like, what actually for you, Sonia, what do you think our foreign correspondents? So our foreign correspondents are people who come from presumably from Western countries to go to other countries. Is that, to what degree is that necessary anymore? Are there things that they can bring that bring to a story that local journalists can't? And of course, are there things that local journalists bring to a story that a foreign correspondent couldn't?
Thanks for asking that question. And it ties to what Mustafa was raised in his remarks, which is the sort of, I guess, the abuse of a local journalist by Western media. I think many of you may or may not be familiar with the term fixer. I find this a very offensive term. And it's a term that newsrooms are very casual in using. The fixer is the person who is hired to assist the journalist, the Western journalist. The fixer is usually a local journalist who has a ton of resources, knows the language, and is really the only reason why the Western reporter is able to tell the story that they're telling. And historically has never had byline support, has not had remuneration of the kind that Mustafa was explaining. And so that's, it's a classic kind of colonial relationship between the fixer and the Western journalist. And you'll see this, I know when I was reporting in Kabul in those days, Western journalists could hang out in zones after they had done their reporting and have a drink or whatever in a place, and locals were not allowed to enter. And it always struck me as how do you as a reporter feel comfortable participating in that separation of society in that way when you are here to be the reporter on the ground? But, as sheep, we tend to participate in things without questioning them. And I think this is where the role of the research and the academy becomes so important, and to create like that relationship, because oftentimes when we are practicing, we're just practicing what we've been told. Practice, 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 get the story, do the work. And there's not enough time to have thoughtful process behind it, especially if you're a news reporter, right? I think long-form journalists have a greater luxury in that sense. But I think the local reporter is critical. And I have seen a shift in mainstream newsroom practice in kind of onboarding the local reporter. So you'll see certainly the Times, as an example, there are people who never had byline before, who now have not just bylines, but more official positions within the newsroom. But it remains a genuine issue, especially as the sort of lure of the old school Ernest Hemingway type of Western correspondent is gone, right? Like there is no position like that anymore. There's very few bureaus open. And I think if you think about Gaza, it's a perfect example where there are so many people on the ground who are boots on the ground, who are reporting first-person narratives. Why would traditional newsrooms not bring those reporters into the fold and say, you're my reporter for this, can you report to me regularly? I have nobody else on there. But instead, they see them as Instagram influencers or like not journalists, that these are citizen reporters, or they're not even journalists because they're biased. And so they're creating this wall that actually obfuscates the capacity to do journalism. So yes, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to shift how we have traditionally done journalism and to be more open. And it strikes me as, I don't know about the German experience, it strikes me as sad and truly embarrassing in a country like Canada that has that prides itself on things like multiculturalism, but does not know how to apply those ideas in not just the newsroom, but really in any industry. As you know, there are people in Canada who are who have built bridges around the world, but are driving cabs because the industries don't allow them to practice their profession here because they don't have Canadian work credentials. So there's lots of gaps in how countries like Canada have applied those principles to this idea of immigration. And now you've got like second, third generation people in Canada who are asking these questions of the system. These are systemic discrimination patterns that don't allow the Canadian newsroom ultimately to be able to do its job effectively. There's one other thing I just wanted to add, and this is connected to the genuine capacity of a reporter to cover international news without being allied to its own foreign policy. So when we talk about independence, this is a real challenge because, for example, Canada is a country that does not recognize Palestine, right? Does not recognize Palestine's official status. There's many countries that recognize it, but the US, Canada, Israel are among countries that do not. Therefore, in the newsroom, there is a rejection of the use of the word Palestine, as we know, right? And that one of our reporters, Rahaf Faravi, wrote about this for the Review of Journalism a few years ago. Therefore, CBC's policy follows a government policy. And so it will say we cannot use the word Palestine because our government, I mean, they're not saying it in such words because independence is supposed to be one of the keystones of being able to do journalism. But really, that's what the code is. And I think you have to ask this question. You can ask this question of German reporters too. What have you been trained to think about what is right and wrong in this crisis? And therefore, how is your training allow you to unpack that and unlearn your biases to be able to report on this like you would any genocide anywhere in the world? And of course, I should mention that coverage of what is happening in Sudan is negligible in Canadian media and is also a part of a larger media narrative problem.
I mean, there are very, as you probably know better than anyone since you've done this research, there are very few Canadian journalists who are stationed in other countries on a permanent or ongoing basis. Even fewer most of those are in like Washington and some in London. But there's probably never been fewer correspondents around the world in general, but certainly in Canada, really is only a handful. The Globe, the CBC, I'm sure there are probably some more in French Canadian media. Probably Radio Canada adds several more to that. And I do often wonder how much of that is the fact that we can take for granted or can rely on obviously British coverage, American coverage. Not that they don't have their own issues, but they have presences that we may not, and also take for granted the fact that in the Middle East and in many places around the world, English may be a person's second or third language, and so we may have the facility to communicate. They may be communicating in English because it's meant to see the rest of the world, or we may be we take for granted that we can communicate with them in that way. So I do wonder in the case of Germany, and Germany, German being a widely spoken language, but not as widely as English. How do you, Konstantin, what do you see as? Are there a lot of German journalists who are permanently or in an ongoing way stationed in the Middle East?
I can only answer this question from the perspective of the newspaper I'm regularly working for. So I guess there are quite a lot of reporters still in Israel. But just to give you one example, the Taz, the newspaper I'm working for, had for many years a long-time reporter stationed in I think it was Jerusalem, and I also met her. and it was the center of her life there. She lived there, and she covered everything: Palestine, Israel, you know, the good stories and the bad stories. And she decided to leave the weeks after October 7 because she has a family there, and she just realized that living anywhere in Israel became dangerous for her. And then she left, and she's now in the newsroom, in our newsroom in Germany, and someone else from my IGP fellowship program is there in her place. So you can see, I think um, coverage, in-person coverage of Israel and Palestine is something that will always be like considered a dangerous thing to do, and so many people are trying to uh, like find a balance between their own security and their ethical commitment to journalism, and I think this will just intensify in the upcoming months.
Do you find that with German being a language that is probably not as widely spoken in the Middle East and other regions of the world, that there is more reason for there to be German correspondence there than there, for example, than there might be for Canadian correspondence to be there?
Um, I think so. I think you could rightly say that there should be more German correspondence there, but I think we are also seeing some sort of change of we're having a lot of we're having a lot more journalists, German journalists, who are actually pretty good and also reading English and international media, and you can see it in the articles that they're like quoting Al Jazeera and quoting Haaretz and reading all these kinds of media. I think this wasn't the case 20 years ago or 10 years ago, and so there's some sort of blending in and over here. But I think, yeah, absolutely, there's always a good reason to have actual German correspondence in place, sure.
Um, what I guess actually I'll come back to you, Sonia. From your perspective, you alluded to this, but what would or does a healthy relationship between a foreign correspondent and a local journalist look like?
Well, I mean, I think the foreign journalist has to recognize the value of the local journalist to begin with. That has to be the point of departure of any relationship. And I think the foreign journalist knows better than the editor in the newsroom the work that the local journalist is doing. And therefore, it is on them to ensure that they're also being clear about that in terms of whether or not a byline credit is the appropriate kind of credit that the person should be given. But I think also newsrooms at their structure need to recognize this and think about ways in which maybe they need new models, right? New models of, so if for example, with Gaza, no foreign journalists are in Gaza. Could you have a different model? Could you have a model? I remember the Knight Foundation about 10 years ago had established a grant to play with a different model of international reporting. I was part of that team, not 10 years ago, it's probably 20 years ago. But it was Global Post that they launched, and it was out of the shadows of the collapse of the Boston Globe's foreign reporting bureaus at the time. And the idea was that you could be a foreign correspondent for this kind of replacement of a wire service. So it wouldn't be the wire service that had like no they had slightly different JSPs around how they would report. But the idea was that you could be hired as a reporter, but you could also, like a full-time correspondent, so you could get status and credentials wherever you were, but you could also freelance for other publications. And so you would get like a retainer. And that retainer might have been like $1,500 a month or $2,000. I can't remember exactly what it was. But this idea that you could shift the model of how you operate, and you could create like perhaps a freelancers union or a union of some kind that kind of supports that idea. But this requires imagination. It requires people to come up with ideas, and these ideas require funding. And in Canada, I think Germany has better funding structures than Canada, but in Canada, there isn't a ton of philanthropy that goes towards these kinds of spaces. I know there's some discussion in philanthropic spaces to try and create a media fund, but we certainly need more spaces that allow for the thinking to happen, that allow for ideas to be tried and experimented, and that requires participation of wider society than just the newsrooms, which are kind of struggling to survive.
Sorry, Constantine, do you see that, has there been a similar, would you say that there's been a similar shift in thinking in Germany in terms of, I'm not sure that I should have looked up the German term for fixer, but in terms of in terms of what collaborations with local journalists look like? Or do you? No.
First, we also use the term fixer, but I feel now reluctant to use it because Sonia just said she said she doesn't like it, and now I don't like it either. But I don't really see a change in any kind of capacity. This is just the first time I've heard anyone even presenting a form of new idea like Sonia just did right now. Usually, the work with fixers, as far as I know, is traditional. So these are mostly anonymous people who help you out, and if they're lucky, they get some cash or maybe a pat on the back, I don't know. But especially when it comes to Gaza, you have to realize that almost any journalist who's working there, even before the war, is entirely dependent on fixes on local journalists, because if you want to enter Gaza, you don't only have to cooperate with the Israeli government and the IDF, you also have to present Hamas someone who is responsible for you. You have to have some sort of formal invite from someone from Gaza inviting you there. And this, I hope I don't use the wrong words here, but this serves as some sort of life insurance for Hamas. So if you do anything that they don't want, this other person is going to be responsible. And just imagine what that means.
Wow.
It's such an immense pressure on these people who sometimes don't even get any byline anywhere, and it's a devastating state of operation, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's also, not all fixers are necessarily journalists or do journalism work, but many, if not most, are. And I think I see that sort of the move away from that term toward local journalist or something like that is similar to, in the film and TV industry, moving away from the term extra to background actor. Now, obviously, they're usually more than a background actor, but I think it's at the very least sort of a reconfiguration of like, this is a person who performs this ancillary function to this is someone who is actually doing work, even if it's not necessarily at the center of the focus. So that, once again, often it is. And as Anya said, places like the New York Times, and which does effectively set the standards for much of the rest of the Western media, have taken to pointedly crediting those the people on the ground, usually alongside them. Do you think we should go to questions now? Or yes, sorry.
Mustafa has an important update, a quick one that he'd like to share.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm sorry to share that, but yesterday media talked about ceasefire agreement.
Mm-hmm.
But while we are talking, Justin had to run because there is a warning in his place.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, I reached out. He is okay, and
Okay.
he will stay okay. And I need to mention that place. It's Hamra Street, and Hamra Street is I lived there for 1 year and a half. It's like home for me. And it's the most diverse place in Beirut, including a lot of foreigners. The American University in Beirut and the Saudi Arabia embassy. And I reached out to other friends to confirm the information, and they confirmed that there are warning in Hamra Street right now. So hopefully they will be okay. They are fine till now, and hopefully they will be okay. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for conveying that. Thank you for being in touch with them. I think it's very, it's so I think it says a lot that, yeah, there are a lot of people, I mean, Justin is obviously this very specific example. There are lots of people who aren't able to be parts of conversations like this because they are too busy running for their lives. And I think that frames how we talk about these issues and think about these issues more generally. People who have things to say that are deeply relevant, perhaps even necessary, but because of practical physical conditions don't even have the opportunity to contribute those perspectives. That's certainly, yeah, the structural way that certain voices are excluded. Should I toss to Beatrice for? Should I throw to Beatrice for a question? Yeah, so Beatrice, who's one of the other fellows, who's in Ghana, she hasn't been able to get a visa to come here. Has a question she'd like to pose.
Yeah, so Ashley Fitzpatrick, I'm one of the other journalism fellows, the last one. But I'm going to read Beatrice's question for her. And I think it actually does come right off of what we just heard about. She was asking, what role do you believe, and this is for both of the panelists, but what role do you believe ethics play in the safety of journalists covering conflict zones such as the Israel-Palestine war? Are the increasing numbers of journalist fatalities a result of unethical reporting practices or deliberate targeting of journalists performing their duties? And I think it relates to that question of safety. So.
Yeah, I believe the numbers, yeah, as Mustafa says, up to 137 who have been killed, almost all of whom have been in West Bank or Gaza in the West Bank, a couple in Lebanon, or so actually, I don't get to get the numbers wrong. So, sorry, to repeat that question, to repeat the question, or just? Oh, didn't hear the word it said. I was saying, as Mustafa alluded to, yeah, 137 people by the Committee of Direct Journalist Count have been, 130 journalists and media workers have been killed in mostly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, Israel, and Palestine, or West Bank, Israel, and Lebanon the past year. Sonia, did you want to answer the question? Take the question.
Well, it's upsetting to think about Justin in this moment. And I'm just, it is a perfect segue for this conversation and the irony of sitting and chatting about something. 137 is CPJ's number, and I believe the number goes up to 189 or 90, depending on who's tracking. I mean, look, journalists are human beings, and they are members of society. And so if journalists are dying or are being killed, sorry. I just did a Canadian journalism thing. In Gaza at this moment, and in Lebanon, I think so are hundreds of other people. And I'm mentioning thousands of other people. I mention this because, I think 350 members of Palestine's football, as in soccer, federation are dead in the last several months. Just thinking about every industry, the schools, the universities. There is not a single standing university in Gaza today. That is a very specific, and so the question that Beatrice asked, the question about systemic targeting, I think it's very clear from all the information that we have that there is specific targeting of journalists. In many cases, they have been wearing their press vests at the time that they have been killed. So they're identified. I think there's targeting of very specific spaces in addition to journalists. There's specific targeting of universities. There's specific targeting of the education infrastructure of Gaza. Gaza had, 2 universities not so long ago. The sort of community in Gaza has come together to build institutions specifically because they see education as a really important part of strengthening their youth. And so to have every university in Gaza destroyed is a really, should be a huge concern for everyone around the globe. And so I think that, yes, there's been very specific targeting. The question of ethical practice, I think, I don't think that journalists covering journalists who cover crisis zones do take risks, as we know. In any crisis zone, there are inherent risks in what you're doing. I know that I have taken risks, and I was lucky in many situations to walk away from those risks. I know fellow journalists who have not been as lucky, and that is a function of the practice in a way. I think many journalists receive training ahead of going into crisis zones. And that training is usually provided by, ex-military or security people. There are organizations that provide this kind of training for newsrooms. And I think that's another challenge because we are forced to usually have training only with ex-military or ex-security officials, which have a very specific approach to how to protect yourself. I think that there's not very much you can do in a situation like Gaza. You are exposed. So, you can take certain protections and have safeguard yourself to some extent. But beyond that, you're at risk every single day that you are in that zone. I am thinking about this research that I've been doing on the use of drones in Gaza and in international zones, specifically as a strategy. And the US and the Obama administration, more than the Bush administration, actually deployed drones very consistently in the war on terror in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and has applied that practice in other places where they said they were doing precision attacks. And those precision attacks were meant to take out high-level targets. But there's so much evidence, and the numbers do not show that this is precision targeting. It shows that it's very much collateral damage that is extensive and affects civilian populations at very high numbers. So I think alongside that, we know that journalists have been told that they will be targeted, and they have been targeted as a result. Their families have been targeted. There have been numbers of journalists, family members, family members amounting to 20, 30 who've been killed as a direct response to the work that they've been doing. So I think it's been very targeted, but I think it's not a question of a failure to do ethical journalism. I think it's a question of who the aggressor is and how they're getting away with their practices, and that there is no accountability despite the language of universal human rights that is espoused by Western governments in the way that it is. Also keep in mind that you cannot disconnect any of these conversations from the larger structure of global politics, and the fact that if you think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came into force in 1948, that the UDHR, which was prized by Eleanor Roosevelt, at a time when Black Americans didn't have the right to vote. So that was a reality domestically in the US, while internationally the US was espousing universal human rights. Most of the world at that point was still colonized. So whose signatories are on those documents are also things to question when we think about the structure of the United Nations and how these documents have been forged and pushed forward. So, sorry, that's going on a big tangent, but I do think that these things, connecting the dots is really important to do proper critical analysis. And I think our newsrooms fail to do this because there aren't enough people who have knowledge about international systems in the way that they should. And I think in Canadian newsrooms, that probably is not as true for German newsrooms, but in Canadian newsrooms in particular, the understanding of the global landscape of colonialism and its multiple impacts over a 250-year period is not very strong. And so it leads to weak reporting.
Constantine, would you like to offer your thoughts on any of that? I mean, the question, or actually, what my particular question is there, what is, if anything, the understanding of, I guess, colonialism in German newsrooms, just running off with what Sonia just said in terms of what the degree to which there is or isn't understanding here and how that affects how things are reported. Would you say that is an element?
Well, I don't think I can answer this question much better than Sonia just did. But when it comes to the colonial past of Germany, I think this is also something that we are experiencing for the past, let's say, maybe 5 or 10 years. That not just government officials, but also journalists begin to interact, or even like be aware of Germany's colonial past. So far, any discussion about global implications of politics in Germany has always been about World War II, the Nazi-era Germany, and the Holocaust. And so this overshadowed a lot of the other discussions that should have taken place. And I think that now there's some significant balancing put forward in this discussion, but it's a very early stage. And yeah, I think that's the most I can say about this.
Thank you. Shri, did you have a question? Or Ashley, sorry. My apologies.
Sorry, I think just kicking off, I guess, from the audience questions, I'll get it started. But I guess quickly, and it relates to the earlier discussion that has been had around language. I mean, there's been a lot of it here today. One of the things I'm wondering about is audience. So really fascinating to me how in both Germany and Canada, you have an issue, I think clearly, where parts of the country are maybe more disconnected from this story overall than other parts, individuals more connected than others. And you also have newsrooms that have what they consider their core audience and the people that they're trying to connect with. In some instances, in particular, while we were in Germany, we heard, there are certain terms even that can be total barriers and shut down conversations, end up with very little in terms of uptake on stories simply by having the word within the story to begin with. So I'm wondering, is there any legitimate situation where the change in language is warranted simply to remain connected to the audience or to keep a conversation going? Is there an argument to be made for using alternative language that may not be as hard hitting, but still be accurate? You can argue the degree, but at least doesn't shut down that conversation, because that's the argument that we often heard, and I have heard here at home as well.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
Can you give me an example of
Sure.
what
Very specifically, the word genocide is like an automatic. We heard, in terms of German newsrooms, that if you bring out that word, very early on, they see a shift and a reaction in the audience, and in particular in areas that maybe aren't deep into the debate to begin with, it can be a turnoff.
I have just one other thing, if I can say.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, I think I'd also ask the question, which is, who is the audience you're measuring? Because I think that's an interesting one, because Canadian newsrooms have an idea of who their audience is. They don't want to shift that audience. They don't want to change that audience, even though that audience may be dying out, for lack of a better word. But I mean, there is an idea that there is an entire audience that is wider than the audience that you are imagining. And how is that audience responding to language? But anyway, that's just a question around, like, when we talk about research, who's doing the research, how is that research done, and who has been polled? Because that also...
Because there are also the tensions between, international news tends to be something that usually is conveyed through national news, addressing an ostensibly national audience, or at least in Canada, an English Canadian audience. Whereas, this, conflicts or wars and crises in other parts of the world obviously affect things here. And so inevitably, in particular with this one, do end up getting discussed in the context of local news, including even local news outside of large cities. And so I think, as Ashley often reminds us, like trying to think about how do different newsrooms of different scales and different serving different parts of the country, what are the things that they can or can't take for granted? It's a really, and one of the things they can or can't take for granted in communicating with their audience is a really interesting question. Constantine, do you find, well, I guess Could you tell us, like, who do you see as the audience for Taz?
It's a particularly interesting question because Taz has a notorious problem defining what their audience actually is, because it's a left-leaning newspaper that stemmed from a very classic anti-imperialist movement, and much of the older audience that we have, and when I say older, I mean, please don't get me wrong, but I mean like 60 plus, is still very anchored in this kind of movement and thinking. And so these people are classic anti-imperialists and even anti-Zionists, and they have absolutely no problem if you say the word genocide. But as Sonia also just mentioned, this is an audience that Taz not only thinks of themselves as their core audience. The other core audience that many journalists at Taz think of is a much younger audience, something that maybe in American terms you would call liberals or Greens, and they're having a different stance and perspective on this. Ironically, because I think normally in many other countries you would think that the younger audience is the one that is more critical and more harsh or more radical. And it's not always the case in Germany, and so we have long discussions about the right wording to get both of these audiences to like not push them too far away, because it is true. What we just heard, that if you use the wrong words in the first abstract, they will just shut it down and write you a bad mail and say this is bullshit. And so what our authors usually do, or editors, is they're trying to find ways around certain words, especially with quoting, right? And now it's pretty easy to quote the ICJ or the UN. If you do not want to write the word genocide, you just say what has been characterized as a genocide by many genocide scholars or Holocaust scholars. This is what Taz does all the time. It doesn't feel right, but I have to admit it's one of the most effective ways to kind of work with both of those audiences without actually like bending the truth.
I appreciate
Yeah.
that's
Great example.
appreciate hearing that newsroom conversation. And actually, I was thinking that, um, you know, I think about this quite a bit. Like when we say things like colonialism, do people understand what that means, right? And how do you need to break it down, because that is a job of a journalist, is to be able to transfer information in a understandable way. And I think there are a lot of words that need to be unpacked, and that have a reaction. And it doesn't feel right at some level. But on the other hand, I think about words like I think equity, for example, is a word that is now drawing a negative reaction. So you think about Black Lives Matter and the post George Floyd's murder. There was a moment where there was a great space for conversations about equity. And that space in Canada, and I don't know, possibly in the US, is slowly shrinking, because people are like, okay, we've discussed equity enough. We don't want to talk about this anymore. And that to me is a real failure of our capacity to understand like the long-term depth of like, kind of systemic patterns of discrimination. So I think it's a good conversation to have, like, how do you get people to actually engage with some of these ideas in a deep and meaningful way? I don't know the answer exactly, because we're also in a business of less words, not more words, and conveying ideas quickly. But I certainly think that for me, it's a point of departure. Any storytelling has to be rooted in understanding the historical context. And I heard after October 7th, a lot of people saying context is not important. It's not important. This is a massacre, and you cannot discuss context. And I think, well, that's not journalism. You cannot do journalism if you do not discuss context. Context is everything in a story.
Thank you. Do we have a question from the audience? Oh, Sorry, I thought we...
I had a lot of questions, but I had to leave. First off, I'm an academic, and I really appreciated the comments by Sonia and Constantine. I think they were just top flight. The problem with journalism, okay, this is an elitist position, is that anybody can call themselves a journalist. I went to Portugal in the mid-1970s after the revolution. I got journalist credentials. Did that make me a journalist? I don't think so. And I'm a dinosaur. So I rely on the dinosaur media. Why do I not go to social media? Where, Sonia, you're suggesting, oh, we've got to switch what we're doing because the audience is falling away. But social media is not broadcasting. It's narrowcasting. If I go to social media, I'm going to get caught up in one line. And that's leading to the polarization that we have because we don't have a common narrative. But I've got a lot of points. May I make some of them? For example, the idea that you get excluded, like Haaretz, I heard. I used to read Haaretz before they put up a paywall. I'm frugal. And only 4% of Israelis apparently tune into Haaretz, so it's not as relevant. So the issue about being cut out, that government sources won't talk to the reporters at Haaretz, and Haaretz is a terrific paper. That's the only one I used to look at in Israel. But that happens here as well. Will Pierre Poilievre talk to the CBC? I don't think so, and he tells his MPs that he can't. Can a journalist in Gaza communicate with an Israeli journalist or Israeli media? So every country has these problems. That we're privileged because we live in a liberal society, so we look at things in certain ways. Here's another thing that caught me, if I may say. I got a lot of notes though, is I've heard now twice today references to the bombings in Beirut today. It's very real. People are dying. I didn't hear anybody mention that 250 rockets were launched to Tel Aviv yesterday. And those certainly are not targeted. They're indiscriminate. We've had Palestinians on the West Bank killed by rockets coming from Lebanon. So, anyways, and I completely agree with Sonia. The reason Jerry Friesen is a historian is because context is everything. And you have to put October 7th into the context of what was going on in Palestine and what was not going on in Israel, because I read the Times of Israel now, and incidentally, I'm also tuning in every day to Arab news, and I've been now tuning into Tehran Times. And these are establishment dinosaur media, but those journalists are also circumspect about the language they use and the line that they can pursue. And for us to pretend that this is only a Western phenomenon is actually to underestimate how much more dominant or prevalent this form of state control is in other societies. We are privileged. I say that as someone born behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And what's your field of, I'm just curious, you're a professor, I'm just curious what area?
I beg your pardon?
You mentioned you're a professor, I'm just curious what did you do or did you teach, what area?
I'm a political scientist who's become more interested in history, but my field, my area of study is Canadian politics.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very, very stimulating session.
So you're going to make the comments and now you're going to go so we can respond to your comments?
Would you like to respond? Or do we want to go to another, do you want to go to a question?
Well, I think there's something you said that I would like to respond
absolutely.
to. I think that in the work that I do, I always look at power. And I think you cannot isolate power from a conversation, which is why in journalism, the he said, she said is so problematic, because it it sometimes assumes that you have to get both sides. Well, first of all, there are not ever two sides. There's multiple sides, usually, to any complex story. But I think when we talk about the Western bias, it has to do with global power hierarchies as well. And when we're talking about the Middle East and we're talking about this region, understanding the relationship of Western governments with problematic Arab governments, with tin pot dictatorships and so on, is part of the conversation that doesn't actually, we can go back to 9/11 and talk about how the Bin Laden family's connection was to the Bush administration, and to continued relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, the U.S. relationship with Egypt. I mean, all of these are really complex systems, and I can tell you, certainly the U.S. government, for all of its foreign policy talk around human rights and so on, has always, in terms of Pakistan, been much more supportive to military dictatorships. So the support for democracy is not there historically in other places, and this is why it's the scanner has to be on Western governments in terms of these relationships, because the language of human rights, the language of press freedoms comes from the West, right? It doesn't come from those places where people cannot report freely on the ground.
Cool. That's great. Thank you. Other questions? I think yes, please. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I actually wanted to ask Constantine a question about his experiences, your lived experiences as a journalist covering Israel Palestine. In German media. And I also wondered, for example, have you been criticized or targeted for the work that you've done? And I'm also interested in learning about whether, I think, Sonia, you painted a picture of the state of Canadian media over the last year, but even beyond that, before October 7th, about how dire the coverage has been, how one-sided it's been. And I think one thing that I wanted to add to that point was the sheer number of whistleblowers that have come forth in exposing what's happening inside newsrooms. And so I just was curious to see if that phenomenon has also been happening in any way in Germany, Constantine.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah, would you like to answer
that? So have I been criticized or targeted for my work? Yes, I have regularly, and but not in an existential way, right? I've been people have said mean things about me from any side of this conflict that you might imagine, but most recently I was trying something that I think Sonia just pointed out is somehow impossible, and if you try to report on Israel and Palestine and what is going on in front of us, and you tend to do something that is, let's call it aggressive both-sidism. So I literally wrote a text, and I put remarks on the side on, okay, this is 20% Palestinian perspective, this is 20% Israeli perspective, and now I have so and so much percentage left for it to be even to the words counted to be equal, so no one can make the assumption that I was having a one-sided perspective. I really did something like that, and it's kind of bizarre to think about it in that way. And still, when you do something like that and you think you have the most balanced position anyone could ever have, and you will still upset some people. So I think this applies for writing about the Middle East. It also applies for living and working in the Middle East. No matter what you do, you will always upset some group of people, and I think you just have to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, that is often a challenge, I think. Yeah, you don't want to necessarily infer that because, I'm not saying you're doing this, but there's some people who may infer, some journalists may infer that because people on both sides or multiple sides are annoyed, that means they've done a good job. And that may be the case, but probably isn't. And because, as I said, because no piece of journalism is perfect, because like there really is nothing in the universe that humans create that is perfect. Someone can always find something to take it apart. But I also want to put the question to you, Sonia. Have you been targeted in a way that you'd like to, in any way that you want to talk about, or
I mean, HRC has highlighted me a couple of times.
honest reporting
But that,
Canada?
yeah, that's not nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing serious. I mean, I'm not in the line of fire like a lot of journalists are, and in that sense, like being at the university is a great advantage to be able to be. I mean, in some of our work for the Canada Press Freedom Project, we're looking at these kinds of issues because we're able to kind of put together things from a Western perspective that say, look, in Canada, here are the challenges that we have in our capacity to do journalism. Because the idea of press freedoms has always been like, oh, there's a problem in these countries where you cannot report because you'll be arrested the minute you're seen to be a reporter and so on. But in Canada, we have very specific challenges to press coverage and to freedom of the press, and those are things like access to information challenges, right? Like getting information from the government is extremely challenging, and there are great kind of hurdles in the way of doing that work. There's the rise of populism and misinformation and disinformation, sort of kind of global barriers, the sort of inclusion of voices in the newsroom around the story table. Those are all very big challenges. So I think that I'm in a position where I'm able to have those discussions with students, to have those discussions with in terms of research. And yeah, I don't experience the same level of harassment that some of my colleagues in the newsroom do.
Thank you. I think we have another question from the audience. The microphone's coming around.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of go out here because I'm back here too.
Sure, the camera's on both sides, so don't worry.
So that's fine. So
actually, I don't know.
One is a question and one is a comment. And so, Sonia, I was really, my name is Nurjahan Mawani. I'm a senior fellow here and chair in global engagement. But my comment is about your reminding us of the use of the term fixer. I was in Afghanistan for 7 years and as a diplomat. And one of the disappointments for me was to see the use of the term fixer and somehow the way in which I'm not going to use the term callousness because that's too strong, but the way in which that term was used, especially including by respected international journalists. And so I want to thank you for reminding us all. And I think Konstantin talked about the fact that it's a term that's used, but I think the importance of giving respect, especially as you said, they have very little role. I mean, they have a huge role, but they have very little recognition. And also very often in very dangerous situations that they are put in. The second is it's a question. I mean, first of all, thank you very much. I'm Massey and the German Consulate for this, and to all of you. The question is about what sort of role does PEN International play in all of this? We have PEN Canada, we have PEN International, and its role, as I understand it, has been to support journalists and to protect journalists through the work that PEN does all over the world, many countries, and has done a very good job in many contexts. But for me, it's been a silence on this from PEN. And I've been looking out for that. Am I wrong in this? Am I not looking in the right places? So I'm going to ask that question because I think there's a role for PEN. Look at the numbers of journalists that we are talking about being killed.
It's a good question. There are lots. Without talking about PEN specifically, there are definitely cases where have been organizations that you would think would have spoken out more, particularly about the number of journalists who have been killed that haven't. PEN being the International Freedom of Expression Organization. Has that intersected with anything you've seen around this? Have you? I don't know.
I think PEN has been silent. I think they did release something a few months ago. Eventually, it was very late, and I think that like many other organizations of its kind, they are under pressure from various spaces, and the silencing is really interesting to see, right? The silencing impact, but also slash the hypocrisy. So I'm going to go away from PEN because I don't know the internal dynamics of why or why not they haven't released it, but I can only assume because they're usually very quick to speak about any kind of situation where there is a concern for the freedom of expression of a writer. Like if you think about multiple organizations that have been silent, but we have in close proximity to other crisis situations, the war in Ukraine and the Afghanistan crisis. And those were two situations where people are very comfortable expressing their perspectives. People, including journalists, will change their profile page to show the Ukraine flag or to demonstrate, support for women in Afghanistan. These are easy and quick determinations that people make, but they don't see the hypocrisy of saying, because at the same time, if you ask them, what is your perspective on this crisis? They'll say, oh no, as a journalist, I cannot express my perspective because it's not right. I'm supposed to be neutral. So not neutral on this war, but neutral on this war. And I think these kinds of equations or calculations are reflective even in organizations. So why is PEN silent for so long? I think that's a question to ask them. That's a question to put forward, but it is unusual. And I think that's the point. What is unusual is all the organizations that usually are really quick to identify problems are silent, and their silence is a reflection of the larger problem of being able to discuss Israel and Palestine in a freer way.
And Constantine, would you say with regard to PEN or maybe civil society in Germany, we've discussed how German discourse is often reluctant to engage in this, but would you say you've seen the same things of organizations that you maybe would have expected to have been maybe weigh in more forcefully or weigh in at all that don't appear to have?
Actually, I don't know much about PEN to be honest, and Germany has its own PEN, and actually Germany has two PENs because it has a PEN Germany and PEN Berlin because they are fighting over whatever issues, I don't know. But yeah, I share the impression of Sonia that many organizations that usually put out a statement in any kind of situations where journalists are in danger did put out statements, but with a certain delay, and that kind of delay is it's making me somehow nervous. I don't know, because I can't explain why is that, and sometimes I feel like I could imagining them being very sensitive and very sensible, but I'm the situation doesn't justify to have such a delay, I think. So yeah, I share completely the impression that Sonia just uttered.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. If anyone would, oh yes, thank you.
My name is Emma, I'm a junior fellow.
Hello.
Just a general question about what your thoughts are in terms of in Canada, like CBC, et cetera, The Economist not being allowed to be shown on social media. I think we need to we need to accept the reality that the way that youth engage with news is through social media. And because when we talk about equity, like a lot of people don't have the financial capacity to have subscriptions to certain media outlets. So what do you think the role is of that, and what's the responsibility for us to be able to get accurate news out to the broader community? And keeping in mind that social media is how our youth engage with news in the world.
And with not being allowed to be shown, you mean with respect to Meta's ban on posting news on Facebook and Instagram?
Correct, yes.
Okay. It just occurred to me that there was something that the gentleman who left had said that was relevant to this conversation. And he was talking about using social media and that social media is insular and kind of people are more divided on social media. And I just wanted to make the point that that's not what I was suggesting. What I was suggesting is that there are people who are forced onto social media because they've been not brought into the traditional news environment. So they are they're creating narratives because they're not being included or not being given an opportunity to participate. And I think that that's an important kind of clarification. Yeah, I mean, I think the equity issue is a real concern, and I think that one of the realities of looking at the historical record and thinking about the fact that who read news before, right? I mean, who read news back in the day? Was news ever free? You still had to have a cable subscription if you were accessing news, or you needed to have a subscription to a newspaper. You were still paying for it. So there's a big question of, in the before times, whatever those times were, who was reading, who had access to the news. And of course, there was always government news that was accessible, right? Government funded news, which is why it plays a role, right, in terms of access to the larger CBC or, NPR or any of those publicly funded spaces that are now on the chopping block or partly on the chopping block. I think this is a question about new models and really going beyond the imagination of the traditional structure of society, which was quite elitist, has always been elitist. I don't think those questions were asked before or dealt with before either. It's now, for example, the best example I think about this that shows the conflict is Toronto Life had published a piece many years ago, in which it was the writer was talking about how she had bought a house in Parkdale, which is in Toronto, and the house, she got it at a great deal, which is a classic Toronto life story, right? Real estate, whatever. And she bought the house for, I think it was like $400,000. It's a beautiful house, but it had been there were people living inside it who were homeless, and the story had all kinds of really problematic language around people who are unhoused.
I believe the headline was like, "We bought a crack house."
That's right, we bought a crack house.
In 2017.
Now, that story would have been appreciated by Toronto Life's traditional audience, and there would have been no hue and cry about that piece when it went out to its regular audience. But we're in an age where people can read the same story online. So all of a sudden, when that story went public online after the print issue went on the newsstand, there was a huge response to that story about the framing, the language, the use, the way in which you're talking about people who are dehomed or homeless. And I think that to me was a really interesting reflection of how we have managed to tell stories in the past and gotten away with it, and how our accountability standards have to shift now that the audience is anyone and everyone, right, who has access. So I'm not answering your question, but I'm just wanting to make clear that it's not like things were great before. It's just that we weren't thinking about questions of equity before, that we are now thinking about and trying to think about in a deeper way at a time when things are even more of a crisis, financial crisis and all of that.
I think that with social media, we have The Economist, for example, that put on posts, and you can't read their whole, whole thing. Yeah. But it's an opportunity to engage someone. So someone who may not have access to The Economist before could have access and be like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I want to invest my finances towards this subscription. And so I think that in and of itself is just reducing the opportunity for people to educate themselves or
Yeah.
I mean, do you aware that The Economist exists as a journal?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that every news publication that's a business, which is basic, virtually all of them, or even public, well, except for public broadcasters, has to negotiate with, is trying to find a balance between making your work as widely accessible as possible, or accessible to the people you hope would see it, versus trying to figure out, can we make money from this? Do we not give it so much away for free? Like Constantine's newspaper Taz has pop-ups that say very proudly offer it for free. We offer this for free, but please give us money. We'd really appreciate it, since it is, I'm pretty sure, a commercial business. Constantine, is there any? I think we're going to wrap up. So I just want to ask: is there anything else, Constantine, you think that Canadians should know about how Germany sees this issue, or how this is covered in Germany? Anything that may not have been touched on? We've touched on a lot. I'm curious if there's any other stray thoughts that you're hoping to get out.
Yeah, I think we touched on a lot of topics. I mean, about Germany's relation to Israel, I could like probably hold a lecture about this and not stop talking and still find something new to talk about. But I think we essentially covered many very interesting topics and questions right now. And yeah, thank you for letting me be a part of this, and thank you for moderating this.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you so much to Sonia, and we really hope Justin was okay, and yeah, I hope we're able to connect with him soon. I'm very sorry he wasn't for the most pressing possible reasons wasn't able to join us today. But then thank you, of course, everyone for coming. Thank you to the German Consulate for sponsoring this. Thank you to Massey, as always. I have so much gratitude. And everyone is welcome to join us upstairs informally for lunch, unfortunately, except for you, Constantine, after this, which is, I guess, basically, I think that's everything. Thank you.